At 72 years old, I heard my son say, inside the woodworking shop I built for 40 years, "Dad, you're not young anymore. Let me take over. This will all belong to me someday anyway." I stayed silent because I wanted to believe he cared. But days later, I discovered he had changed my business name, replaced my contact information, and secretly planned to take control of everything I built. So I made one decision that would leave him with nothing he expected. I appreciate you listening. Before the story continues, leave a comment. Have you ever had family take something that belonged to you? Just yes or no is fine. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. A quick note: some details have been shaped for storytelling. The message at the heart of this is what I hope resonates. At 72, I've learned that the worst kind of theft isn't the kind that breaks your door. It's the kind that knocks politely and calls you dad. But back in December 2022, I didn't know that yet. I still woke at 5:30 every morning, made my coffee in the small kitchen of my house in Gainesville, Georgia, and walked through the wooden gate I built 30 years ago to reach Stewart Woodworks, the shop that had been my life since 1984. The morning air was cold enough to see my breath. The gate hinges creaked the way old metal does, a sound I'd grown to love because it meant I was exactly where I belonged. The shop smelled like it always did: sawdust and machine oil and pine resin. I flipped the lights and stood there a moment, letting the space settle around me. 40 years of work lived in these walls. Every tool had a story. Every machine bore the scars of projects I'd poured myself into when I didn't know if the business would survive another season. I walked to the workbench where I'd left an oak chair half-finished the night before. It was a commission for a neighbor, nothing fancy, just clean joinery and a seat that would hold up for decades. I ran my hand along the armrest, feeling for imperfections. The wood was smooth, cool under my palm. I picked up the sanding block and started working the grain, letting the rhythm quiet my mind. Ruth's photo hung on the wall across from me. She'd been gone 6 years, but I still looked at her every morning. In the picture, she stood in front of the shop on opening day in 1984, holding our first business license, smiling the way she always did when she believed in something. I used to talk to that photo sometimes, even though I knew it was foolish. "Such as the shop's still standing," I said softly that December morning. "Just like you said it would. I've done woodworking for over 40 years. I know when a piece of wood starts developing an internal crack before the naked eye can see it. You learn to read the grain, to feel the subtle shifts in density, to notice when something that looks solid on the surface is starting to fail from within. I just wish I had noticed that sooner with my own son." Ross showed up 3 weeks later on a Friday afternoon in January. I heard the truck before I saw it, a new pickup engine still tight, pulling into the gravel lot outside the shop. He climbed out wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, the kind of casual that still looked expensive. He was 45 years old, my eldest, a wholesale trader who worked deals I never fully understood. Paula, his wife, stayed in the passenger seat watching through the window. "Hey, Dad," Ross said, stepping into the shop with a boxed dinner in his hands. "Thought I'd bring you something to eat." It had been 4 months since I'd seen him. 4 months of silence, and now he was here with takeout and a smile I recognized from his childhood, the one he used when he wanted something but didn't want to ask directly. "Appreciate it," I said, setting down my hand plane. "What brings you by?" "I just wanted to check in." He set the box on the workbench and started walking through the shop, his eyes moving from machine to machine. "This old bandsaw, is it still running? What's it worth these days?" I told him it ran fine. He nodded, moving to the table, saw, then the planer, then the jointer. He asked about each one. How old? How much I'd paid? Whether I'd had them appraised recently. He sounded concerned, like a son worried about his aging father's assets. But I'd seen that look before. Not in Ross, in buyers. in men who walked through the shop pricing lumber by the board foot, calculating overhead figuring margins. Have you ever watched someone you love look at you and realize they're not seeing a person, just an asset with a pulse? "You know, Dad," Ross said, leaning against the workbench where Ruth's photo watched us both, "you're not young anymore. Have you ever thought about letting me help manage? You don't need to shoulder this all by yourself." I looked at him. My son. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd bailed out of minor trouble, the man I'd lent money to more times than I could count. He stood there in my shop, surrounded by 40 years of my sweat, asking if I'd thought about letting him manage it. "I'm managing fine," I said. "I know you are." He smiled. "I just mean, if you ever want help, I'm here. We're family." We ate dinner at my kitchen table. He talked about his latest deal, some investment opportunity that required short-term capital. I nodded and didn't offer money. Paula stayed in the truck the whole time. When he left, he hugged me at the door, and I felt the weight of something I couldn't name yet. That night, I learned something every father fears: the exact moment when you stop being someone your child loves and become something your child wants. I lay awake, replaying the way Ross's eyes had moved across the shop, lingering on the commercial-grade equipment, pausing at the loading dock, calculating the square footage of the lumber storage. My son is a wholesale trader, not a carpenter. He has never held a handplane in his life. But that day he asked about machinery like a man preparing an auction catalog. I should have called him out right then. But fathers make mistakes. We want to believe the best. We want to think that our children see us as more than the sum of what we own. And that belief almost cost me everything. The phone rang at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning in late January, and Floyd's voice on the other end carried the kind of careful tone people use when they're about to tell you something that will change everything. 3 weeks had passed since Ross walked through my shop asking about machinery values. 3 weeks of me trying to convince myself I'd imagined the calculation in his eyes. He hadn't called, hadn't visited. The silence should have been comforting, but it sat in my chest, like a splinter I couldn't reach. I worked through those weeks the way I always did, waking at 5:30, making coffee, walking through the gate to the shop. I sanded oak. I planed maple. I stood before Ruth's photo and told myself I was being paranoid. "Maybe I imagined it," I said to her one morning. Maybe he was just being thoughtful, asking about the equipment. Fathers get paranoid. She kept smiling in that picture, holding our first business license from 1984, looking like she believed everything would turn out fine. "Am I wrong to be suspicious of my own son?" I asked her. She didn't answer. But I told myself the silence meant I was being unfair. That was my first mistake. Then Floyd called. Floyd Fields had worked alongside me in that shop for 20 years, before he retired to focus on his own smaller projects. He was 70 years old, built like a man who'd spent his life lifting lumber with hands that still bore the calluses of someone who understood what real work meant. We'd framed houses together back when we were both young and foolish enough to think we'd live forever. "Hutzi Harry," he said that Tuesday morning, his voice tight. "Do you know anything about the shop's Facebook page being changed? I was standing in my kitchen, coffee cup halfway to my lips. "What are you talking about? I don't even use Facebook." "I know you don't." He paused. "That's why I'm calling. I was looking for your number this morning and found the page. Something's not right." "What do you mean, not right?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm going to send you a screenshot. Just look at it and call me back." He hung up before I could ask what I was supposed to be looking for. My phone buzzed 30 seconds later. I opened the text message and stared at the image on the screen. The Facebook page that used to say Stewart Woodworks Est 1984 now read Stewart Family Woodworks, managed by Ross Stewart. New profile picture? New bio? New contact phone number, Ross's number, not mine. Every detail changed. Without asking, without permission, without so much as a conversation. I sat down at the kitchen table, the coffee going cold in my hand. I kept staring at the screen, reading the words over and over like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. There are two kinds of theft in this world. The kind that smashes your window and grabs what's visible, and the kind that picks your lock while you're sleeping and takes what you didn't know could be stolen. 3 weeks ago, Ross had asked if I'd ever thought about letting him help manage. I'd said I was managing fine. He'd smiled and said he understood. But this morning, I learned he'd already decided the answer was yes. Stewart Family Woodworks, I said aloud to the empty kitchen. Managed by Ross Stewart. My number replaced with his. My name buried under new branding. My 40 years reduced to a footnote, Esther 1984, like I was ancient history, instead of the man who still opened that shop every morning. He didn't ask. He just took it. I didn't call Floyd back. I couldn't find the words yet. Instead, I stood up, walked out into the cold morning air, and crossed the yard to the shop. My hands were shaking when I unlocked the door. I flipped on the lights and stood in the center of the empty space, surrounded by machines I'd bought with money I'd earned one project at a time over 4 decades. Ruth's photo hung on the wall where it always did. In it, she looked the way she always did when she believed something was worth fighting for. Calm, certain, unafraid. I hadn't taken that photo down in 40 years. I wasn't about to start now. Your name is the only thing you're born with and die with, that no one is supposed to be able to take. My son had just proven me wrong. They changed the name, I said to her photo. Ross changed our name. She kept smiling. But the business she was holding in that picture no longer belonged to the man who built it. My identity had been stripped away with a phone and a keyboard, replaced by my son's face and my son's number, and a new name that erased me from my own life's work. My 40 years? I whispered. I built this shop with your earrings and my hands, and my son just erased me from it. The morning light came through the windows the way it always did, illuminating sawdust that hung in the air like snow that never fell. Everything looked the same. The tools, the workbenches, the smell of wood and oil, but nothing was the same. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was planned. Ross had walked through this shop 3 weeks ago asking about machinery values, not because he was concerned, but because he was inventorying. He'd offered to help manage not because he cared about my workload, but because he was already positioning himself as the manager. And I'd let him walk out that door without saying a word. I built that shop from the first permit to the final nail. My name on the sign was the only thing I never thought needed protecting. I was wrong. That afternoon, after staring at the Facebook screenshot until my eyes burned, I walked to the shop office and opened the left drawer of my desk, the one I haven't cleaned out in 40 years, and pulled out 2 things that told the real story of what my son was trying to steal. The first was a pair of simple gold earrings wrapped in faded tissue paper. The second was a folded handwritten note on lined paper, the ink worn soft with time. Ross thinks he's stealing a business. He has no idea what he's actually trying to take. I sat down in the old wooden chair and held those earrings in my palm. They were small, unremarkable, the kind you'd see in any pawnshop window and never notice. But these earrings built this shop, and the note in my other hand represented who deserved to inherit it. I closed my eyes and let myself remember. Summer of 1984. I was 32 years old and had $47 in the bank. Ruth and I had been married 3 years. Ross was a baby, barely walking. I worked as an assistant carpenter during the day and spent every evening building the shop on an empty lot behind the house we rented. The walls were up, but there was no roof, no windows, no doors, just wooden frames and dreams I couldn't afford to finish. The lumberyard wouldn't extend more credit. I'd maxed out what little faith they had in me. I remember sitting in the middle of that unfinished shop one evening in August, the Georgia heat still radiating off the concrete floor even after sunset. I had my head in my hands, Ruth's accounting ledger open beside me. She kept every number in perfect handwriting, tracking every penny we spent and every penny we didn't have. The entry from that week read, August 1984, lumber needed $340, available funds $47, shortfall $293. I was out of money. I couldn't finish it. Ruth found me there as the last light faded. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat down beside me on that bare concrete floor and placed her hand on my shoulder. We sat there together in the dark, listening to cicadas outside the unfinished walls. "We're not done yet," she said finally. I didn't believe her, but I didn't argue. The next morning, I walked into our kitchen and found $320 in cash sitting on the table. Ruth stood at the stove making coffee, her back to me, wearing a dress I'd seen 100 times. But her ears were bare. "Ruth," I said, staring at the money, "where did you get this?" "Pawn shop downtown," she said, without turning around. $320. That's enough for the lumber, isn't it? I looked at her ears, at the empty places where her grandmother's gold earrings had been since our wedding day. The only jewelry she owned. The only thing of value her family had given her. "Ruth, those were your grandmother's earrings." She turned around, then holding 2 coffee cups, and looked at me with eyes that didn't allow for argument. "And this is our future," she said. "We'll keep going. Building something doesn't mean hammering nails and raising walls. Building means giving up the thing you treasure most, because you believe in what doesn't exist yet." I used that $320 to buy the lumber that became the roof. The shop opened 6 months later. Ruth never mentioned the earrings again, but I kept them. When the pawn shop went out of business 3 years later, the owner called me and asked if I wanted to buy them back for $20. I drove down that afternoon and brought them home. Ruth found them in my coat pocket that night. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Yeah, I told her. "I did." She smiled and placed them in the tissue paper and handed them back to me. "Keep them in your desk drawer, so you remember what we did." I opened my eyes in the present, still holding those earrings, and picked up the note with my other hand. Fall of 2008. A young man named Bryce Hampton knocked on the shop door on a rainy afternoon. He was about 30 years old with rough hands that showed he knew how to work and quiet desperation in his eyes that I recognized because I'd worn it myself at his age. "Sir," he said, rain dripping off his jacket, "I need to learn this trade. I can work for free if you teach me. I just need someone to give me a chance." I looked at his hands. Calloused, scarred, honest. "Mart, these are hands that know how to work," I said. "Come back tomorrow morning at 6. He showed up at 5:45. I taught Bryce for 8 months without charging him a penny. He learned fast, asked good questions, and never wasted materials. When he was ready to start his own small projects, he needed tools, professional-grade tools he couldn't afford. I opened this same desk drawer, took out $800 in cash, and placed it on the workbench between us. "For your first tools," I said. "Pay me back when you have it. No rush." 3 years later, in 2011, Bryce returned with the $800 and a handwritten note on lined paper. Inheritance isn't about blood. It's about who understands what was sacrificed to create what you're trying to pass on. Ross never asked what those earrings were. Bryce never needed to. I unfolded the note and read it again, though I'd memorized the words years ago. "Mr. Stewart, you were the first person who believed I could make something of myself. I'll never forget that. Bryce Hampton." I'd put that note in the drawer next to Ruth's earrings in 2011. 2 people who understood what building really means. Now sitting in my office in late January 2023, holding both the earrings and the note, I understood what they meant together. Ross wants to inherit what these earrings built. but he's never met the man who wrote this note. And that's going to matter. I've met many people in 40 years of trade. Most come because they need wood. A few come because they need to be trusted. Bryce was the second kind. And I never thought that years later he would be the only person I'd call when everything fell apart. But that call wouldn't come yet. First, I needed to understand just how far the conspiracy reached. The call came from Atlanta on a Thursday evening in early February. My younger son Milton's face on the phone screen, his expression carrying the kind of careful tension that tells you the conversation ahead will hurt. Milton was 42, worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, wore the same steady look his mother used to carry when she was about to tell me something I needed to hear but wouldn't want to. He'd inherited Ruth's practicality and her unwillingness to waste words. "Dad," he said without preamble. "Ross called me last week. He asked if I'd sign a waiver relinquishing my inheritance rights. Said it would simplify things for you." I was sitting at my kitchen table, the phone propped against a coffee mug. The words took a moment to register. "What did you tell him?" I said no. Milton's jaw tightened. He hung up without another word, didn't ask how I was doing, didn't ask about my family, just hung up. I nodded slowly, keeping my face neutral, even though my chest felt like someone had driven a nail through it. "Thank you for telling me." "Oh, Dad." Milton leaned closer to the camera. "What's going on?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." We talked for a few more minutes. I told him about the Facebook page the name changed, the sudden interest in helping manage. Milton's expression darkened with each detail. "Do you need me to come down there?" he asked. "Not yet," I said, "but stay close to your phone." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen until the light faded. Then I walked across the yard to the shop, unlocked the door, and went to the old filing cabinet in the office. The ledgers were in the bottom drawer, arranged by year. Ruth's handwriting filled most of them, neat columns, tracking every expense, every invoice, every penny that moved through the business from 1984 until the year she died. I pulled out the ledger marked 1998 and flipped through yellowed pages until I found March. There, in my own handwriting, was the entry I'd half forgotten, but never quite erased from memory. March 1998. Paid for Ross's debt, $47,000 business loan. He doesn't know where it came from. I sat down at the old wooden desk and stared at those words. The memory came back sharp and clear. Ross had been 25, full of ambition and bad decisions. His first business venture, some wholesale scheme that sounded good on paper, had collapsed in 6 months. The bank called me directly because I'd co-signed the original loan at his desperate request. "Mr. Stewart," the loan officer had said, "your son is in default. Unless someone pays this balance, we're moving to legal action." I'd paid it the next day. $47,000 pulled from the shop's savings account and a second mortgage on the property. Ruth found out when she was reconciling the books that evening. "Should we tell him it was us?" she'd asked, sitting across from me at this same desk. "No," I'd said. "I don't want him to feel indebted. I just want him to have a fresh start." She'd looked at me for a long moment, then written the entry in the ledger herself before handing me the pen. "You write it, so you remember. I paid $47,000 to save my son from his mistakes, without asking for gratitude. 25 years later, that same son is asking his brother to sign away their shared inheritance without asking for permission. The distance between those two moments is the story of how love dies. I closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer. It was nearly midnight. I should have gone home. But I stayed in the shop office, sitting in the dark, trying to understand how I'd raised a son who could look at his brother's share of their father's life and see only something to take. The answer came the following weekend, when Ross and Paula showed up for dinner. They arrived Saturday afternoon with groceries and smiles. Paula cooked a roast chicken with vegetables and moved through my kitchen like she'd done it 100 times. Ross helped set the table, made jokes about his failed attempts at home cooking, asked about the shop's upcoming projects. It felt warm, almost normal, like family. Paula took photos throughout the visit. Her and Ross in the kitchen. Me sitting in my chair by the window. Her serving dinner with a smile. Ross helping wash dishes afterward. Natural family moments, she said, for the album. At one point, her phone was charging on the coffee table near where I sat. A notification lit up the screen. I was close enough to see the preview. Photo auto-saved to Father Care documentation, Feb 2023. Not family memories, not Dad's visit. Father Care documentation. I said nothing. Took another bite of chicken. Watched Paula smile warmly across the table as she asked if I needed help organizing my bills this month. I'm managing fine, I said. I know you are. Her voice was gentle, concerned. I just mean if you ever want help, we're here. We're family. In 40 years of woodworking, I've learned one thing: the best craftsman isn't the fastest. It's the one who measures before cutting. Paula is measuring. She's been measuring for a long time. She was building something. Not a photo album, a legal case. Every meal she cooked, every dish she washed, every concerned question about my bills documented, time-stamped, organized into folders with clinical labels. I looked at my daughter-in-law across the dinner table, her face warm with practiced care, and realized I was watching someone far more dangerous than Ross. Ross wanted what I owned. Paula understood how to take it. In 40 years of woodworking, I learned that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the loudest one. It's the one quietly taking notes. Paula had been taking notes for months. What she didn't know was that I'd started keeping my own. What I measured first was what my son was willing to do in broad daylight. The first time I saw my name replaced with my son's on a business document was a Tuesday morning in early March, on a lumber order for white oak planks, his signature, where mine should have been written with the confidence of someone who believed he already owned what he was signing for. March had started with Ross showing up at the shop before I did. I'd arrive at 6 a.m. and find his truck already in the lot, lights on inside, the smell of fresh coffee coming from the small office. He'd greet me with a smile and a wave like he was doing me a favor by opening early. By the second week, he was answering the phone. Stewart Woodworks. This is Ross, the manager. How can I help you today? I'd be standing 10 feet away, sanding oak or cutting joints, listening to my son introduce himself as the manager of the business I'd built before he was born. Customers who'd known me for decades would ask to speak to me directly. Ross would cover the receiver and say, "Dad, Mrs. Henderson wants to confirm her cabinet order. I've got it handled. Do you want me to take care of it?" I'd nod. Write down the date, time, and name in a small notebook I kept in my shirt pocket. March 3rd, 2023. Ross answers customer call. Introduces as manager. He changed the work schedules of the 2 part-time employees without asking me. Reorganized the inventory system I'd used for 20 years. Started parking his truck in the spot closest to the entrance, the spot I'd always used, because it was 5 feet closer to the lumber racks when I was carrying heavy loads. Small things, deliberate things. The kind of things that would look like helping to anyone who didn't understand what they really meant. On Tuesday, March 7th, I watched him sign a purchase order for $840 worth of white oak planks. The supplier's rep handed him the form. Ross signed without hesitation, Ross Stewart, manager. Blue ink. Confident strokes. The first time his name appeared on a business document, as if he had authority to commit my money, my credit, my reputation. I pulled out my notebook. March 7th, 2023, lumber order $840. Signed Ross Stewart, manager, white oak. Purchase order, Nadia 471. There's a moment in every theft when the thief stops pretending they're borrowing and starts acting like they own what they're stealing. I watched my son cross that line every time he signed his name where mine belonged, and I wrote it all down. Not because I was building a case, because I was learning how to protect what was mine. "Dad," Ross said one afternoon, standing in the middle of the shop floor surrounded by sawdust and the low hum of machinery. "You've been working really hard lately. Why don't you take a few days off? I can handle things here." I looked up from the table, saw where I was cutting maple boards for a client's bookshelf. "I'm fine," I said. "I know you are." He smiled. "I just mean you've earned a break. Let me take some of the load." I said I'm fine. He shrugged and walked back to the office. I added another line to my notebook. March 12, 2023. Ross suggests I take days off. Offers to handle things. The truth came from Floyd. Mid-March, on a cloudy afternoon that smelled like rain, Floyd showed up at the shop and asked if we could talk in the small coffee room, the private corner space where we'd taken breaks together for 20 years. His face carried the kind of weight that comes from keeping a secret too long. We sat across from each other at the small wooden table I'd built in 1987. Floyd's hands were wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. "Harry," he said carefully, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 2 years ago." I waited. "Ross came here in 2021, Floyd said. "You weren't around. He asked me a question very specific. He wanted to know if someone could prove they'd been managing a business in practice for 2 consecutive years, whether that gave them any legal basis to claim co-management rights." The air in the room felt suddenly thinner. "What did you tell him?" I told him I didn't know, that he should ask a lawyer. Floyd set the mug down, his hands shaking slightly. He thanked me and left, never mentioned it again. And I didn't think it was my place to tell you about a question. But now, watching what he's doing, 2 years ago, I said quietly. 2021, Floyd nodded. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." "You don't need to apologize," I said. "You just helped me understand how much time I have left. 2 consecutive years of practical management." Ross asked that question in early 2021. It was now March 2023, 2 years and 2 months. I've worked with wood long enough to know that patient hands always beat fast ones. Ross had been patient 2 years of watching, asking questions, positioning himself one step at a time. But patience is only an advantage until the other person starts moving. And I had started moving. "Floyd," I said. "When exactly did Ross ask you that question? What month?" "1 January, Floyd said. "Early January 2021. I remember because it was right after New Year's. I pulled out my notebook and wrote it down. January 2021, Ross asks Floyd about 2 consecutive years of practical management legal claim. 2 years. Ross had been planning this since 2021, asking legal questions, calculating timelines, positioning himself as manager in practice. The entire Caring Son routine, the help manage offer in January 2023, the Facebook page change, none of it was spontaneous. It was a campaign measured in years. But campaigns go both ways, and I had just started measuring back. The first thing I measured was how far Ross was willing to go. The answer came faster than I expected. The phone call that turned family betrayal into felony fraud came on a Thursday morning in April, the shop landline ringing at 9:47 a.m. A woman from First National Bank asking to confirm a loan application I knew nothing about. "Shit on Mr. Stewart," she said, her voice professional and careful. "This is Ms. Brennan from First National Bank's Commercial Loan Department. I'm calling to confirm your signature on a commercial loan application for $380,000 submitted by Mr. Ross Stewart using your property at 412 Oak Street as collateral." I was standing at my workbench, a hand plane in mid-stroke across a piece of cherry wood. I set it down slowly. "I know nothing about this loan," I said, keeping my voice level. I have not authorized anyone to use my property as collateral for any purpose. I request you halt this application immediately and keep a record of this call. Silence on the other end. Then, Mr. Stewart, are you saying this application was submitted without your knowledge? That's exactly what I'm saying. See, I see. Her tone shifted to something more formal, more careful. We'll flag this application as unauthorized and contact our fraud department. You may want to speak with an attorney. I will, I said. Thank you for calling. I hung up, pulled out my notebook, wrote down every detail while it was fresh. April 14, 2023, 9:47 a.m. First National Bank. Ms. Brennan Commercial Loan Deptoken. Ross submitted $380,000 loan application using 412 Oak Street shop plus land as collateral. No authorization. Application halted. Fraud debt. Contacted. $380,000. My son had tried to mortgage my life's work without asking. That wasn't family betrayal anymore. That was a crime. There's a line between a son who disappoints you and a son who commits a crime against you. That line is invisible until someone crosses it. Then it's a chasm you can never uncross. My son stepped over it with a loan application and a forged authority he never actually got to use. I didn't call Ross, didn't confront him, didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing I'd caught him or the warning that would let him adjust his strategy. Instead, 1 week later, I walked into Vernon Whitfield's law office in downtown Gainesville. Vernon's practice was small, professional, tucked into a brick building on Main Street that still had the original 1920s woodwork in the doorframes. He specialized in estate and elder law, had spent 25 years protecting elderly clients from exactly what my son was trying to do. Floyd had recommended him years ago when Ruth and I were setting up our wills. Vernon was 63 with silver hair and reading glasses that sat on a chain around his neck. He listened more than he talked, which I appreciated. His office smelled like leather and old paper. I placed my evidence on his mahogany desk, the small notebook logging every action Ross had taken since March. The bank's written notice about the loan application printed screenshots of the Facebook page name change and the original title deed from 1984 showing me as sole owner. Vernon reviewed each document methodically, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When he finished, he looked up at me over his glasses. Your son attempted to use your property as loan collateral without authorization, he said. Under Georgia law, this constitutes attempted elder financial exploitation. You did very right by not confronting him directly. Now we have sufficient grounds. Grounds for what? I asked. Protection, documentation, legal action if necessary? Vernon tapped the title deed. This shows you're the sole owner. Your son has no legal claim to the property or the business. That's your strongest protection. I nodded. I understand that. But I'm not interested in protecting what I own. Vernon raised an eyebrow. I'm interested in selling it, I said. Before my son can do any more damage. I want to know how long do I need to legally sell the shop without anyone being able to stop it. Vernon set down his pen, looked at me for a long moment, understanding shifting across his face. If you start the process right now, he said slowly, with all the proper documentation and title searches, legal clearances, about 6 to 9 months. 6 to 9 months. A reasonable timeline for what was essentially a controlled demolition, not destroying what I'd built, but carefully dismantling my ownership and transferring it to hands that would honor it. Building takes decades. Handing it over to the right person takes less than a year. Both require the same thing, precision. Can you help me do that? I asked. Vernon nodded. I can. But you need to understand, once you start this process, there's no going back. You'll be selling a business you've owned for 40 years. I know exactly what I'm selling, I said. And I know exactly who I'm protecting it from. Do you have a buyer in mind? I thought about the note in my desk drawer, written in careful handwriting on lined paper. The young man with good hands who'd stood in my shop 15 years ago asking for a chance. When I have someone, I said, I need to reach out to him first. Make sure he's still the person I remember. Vernon made another note. Then let's start the groundwork. Title search, property appraisal, business valuation, tax clearances. We do this quietly, thoroughly, and by the time your son realizes what's happening, the papers will already be signed. I stood up and shook his hand. Thank you. One question, Vernon said. Why not just fight him? You have the law on your side. I looked at the title deed on his desk, my name printed in faded ink from 1984. Because fighting him means spending the rest of my life defending what's mine, I said. Selling it to the right person means I get to choose what happens to 40 years of work. My son wants to steal my legacy. I'd rather give it away to someone who deserves it. 6 to 9 months. I spent 40 years building that shop from Ruth's earrings and my own sweat. I could spend another 9 months handing it over to the right person. Ross thought he was racing me to ownership. He didn't know the race was already over, I'd just changed the finish line. But before I could cross that finish line, I needed to understand just how long Ross had been running this race. I found the business card on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, while reorganizing the shop office, a small rectangle of white cardstock wedged so far behind the filing cabinet that it could only have been hidden deliberately or dropped and forgotten in the exact place someone hoped it would never be found. I was pulling out old tax files when it fluttered to the floor. Plain white, professional print. Atlanta Commercial Real Estate Appraisal Services. I picked it up and turned it over. On the back in blue ink, I recognized immediately as my son's handwriting. Woodworks plus 2.3 acres est 1.10 June 2022. I sat down in my office chair holding that card, reading those words over and over. June 2022. 8 months before Ross returned in January, asking to help manage. 8 months before he showed up with boxed dinner and a concerned smile walking through the shop asking about machinery values like a caring son worried about his aging father. He'd had the property appraised in June. He'd known exactly what it was worth, $1.4 million, before he ever knocked on my door, pretending to be worried about my workload. The entire caring son routine, the Facebook page, changed the daily visits, the manager's signatures, the loan application. All of it was a calculated campaign launched after Ross knew precisely what he was trying to steal. I added the card to the evidence envelope I was keeping for Vernon. Wrote another entry in my notebook. April 26, 2023. Found commercial appraiser business card behind filing cabinet. Atlanta firm. Ross's handwriting on back property appraisal est. 1.42 dated June 2022. 8 months before first caring son visit. There's a difference between a son who makes a mistake in anger and a son who calculates for 8 months before making his move. The first might deserve forgiveness. The second deserves exactly what he's about to get. 3 weeks later, Ross made his next move. It was a Saturday evening in mid-May. Ross and Paula showed up at my house with groceries and warm smiles. Paula cooked an elaborate dinner roast chicken with rosemary roasted vegetables, fresh bread, even a peach cobbler for dessert. The house filled with the smell of butter and herbs and care. We ate at my kitchen table. Ross asked about the shop, about upcoming orders, about whether I'd been getting enough rest. Paula refilled my water glass twice without being asked. Everything felt warm and familiar, like family. After dinner, Ross reached into his jacket and pulled out a glossy color brochure. He placed it on the table between us, the same table where 2 months ago he'd asked to help manage, the same table where 6 months ago he'd first started his campaign. The brochure showed a modern building with large windows and manicured gardens. Magnolia Senior Living, Gainesville's premier retirement community. The cover read in elegant script, "Dad." "Ross," said his voice gentle. "Paula and I went to check this out last week. It's beautiful. They have a pool, a craft room, an on-site doctor. You wouldn't have to worry about shop maintenance, yard work, or being alone anymore." Paula leaned forward, her face warm with practiced concern. "Dad wouldn't have to handle any of that big house by himself. Everything would be taken care of. He could just enjoy his retirement." I picked up the brochure, flipped through the pages slowly, looked at the photos of smiling elderly people doing watercolor painting and playing cards, read about the chef-prepared meals and the 24-hour nursing staff. "This looks very nice," I said calmly. "We've already toured the facility," Ross added. "Just to look, get a sense of it. There's immediate availability if you were interested." That was thoughtful of you," I said. I set the brochure down and looked at my son across the table. "Let me look it over. Chess players call it a discovered attack. You move one piece and suddenly a completely different piece delivers checkmate from an angle your opponent never saw coming." Ross was moving me toward the nursing home. He didn't see the broker I'd already called. "There's no rush," Paula said quickly. "We just wanted you to know it's an option for when you're ready." "I appreciate that," I said. We finished dessert. They cleaned the dishes. Ross hugged me at the door and said he'd call next week to see how I was doing. Paula squeezed my hand and told me to take care of myself. I stood on the porch and watched their taillights disappear down the street. Then I walked back inside, sat at my kitchen table and looked out the window toward the shop, glowing softly in the spring darkness. What Ross didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 3 days before he handed me that brochure, I'd sat in a coffee shop downtown with a woman named Shelby Riddle who specialized in commercial real estate sales. I'd placed Vernon's preliminary title report on the table between us and asked her one question: "How fast can you move on this?" Shelby had looked at the numbers, looked at me, and said, "If the buyer's serious and has financing ready, 60 days for a simple transaction. But you're talking about a 40-year business with equipment inventory, title searches, tax clearances, and a name transfer. My honest estimate, 6 to 9 months if you want it done properly." I'd shaken her hand and hired her on the spot. Ross had measured for 8 months before making his first move. I'd measured for 8 weeks and already started mine. That night, I put the nursing home brochure in the drawer next to Ruth's earrings and Bryce's note. 3 artifacts that told the whole story: what I'd built, who deserved it, and what my son thought he could take. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. Not because I wasn't angry anymore, but because I knew what I was going to do. What I was going to do started with watching very carefully. I woke up thirsty at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday in late May, and on my way to the kitchen for water, I heard my son's voice drifting from the living room, casual, confident, speaking about me in the third person, like I was an asset being liquidated rather than a man sleeping 20 feet away. I stopped in the dark hallway between my bedroom and the kitchen. The floorboards were cool under my bare feet. Ross sat in the living room with his back to me, illuminated by the glow of his phone screen, speaking in the low voice people use when they think no one's listening. "I'm talking to a guy with $1.4 million in assets," he said. "The old man is definitely leaving it to me." I stood motionless in the darkness 3 meters from the doorway, close enough to hear every word. "I'm the eldest son," Ross continued. "I'm running the shop now. He has no one else. Just a few more months and everything transfers." Silence while whoever was on the other end responded. "Yeah, I know the timeline's tight," Ross said. "But trust me, it's locked in. Once the transfer happens, we can move on the expansion loan." I didn't move. Didn't breathe louder than necessary. Just stood there in my own hallway listening to my son count money that would never be his. The old man, he'd called me. Not Dad, not my father. The old man. 40 years ago, these hands placed him on the first wooden chair I ever made. I remember the weight of him, barely 2 years old, laughing when I spun the chair in circles on the shop floor, while Ruth watched from the doorway. And now he sat in my living room at 2 in the morning, calling me the old man, to someone who probably thought I was already in a nursing home or worse. I turned around quietly and walked back to my bedroom. Got the water from the bathroom sink instead. Lay awake until dawn. Ross left before I woke the next morning. But I wrote it all down. May 25, 2023, 2:00 a.m. Overheard Ross on phone. Called me the old man. Told unknown party he's running the shop, and everything transfers in just a few more months. Referenced expansion loan after transfer. Assumes inheritance locked in. Your name is the first thing people call you and the last thing they say at your funeral. Between those two moments, if you're lucky, the people you love use it with respect. My son stopped using my name months ago. Now I was just the old man, a placeholder for money he'd already spent in his head. 3 days later, Milton called again. Dad, he said, his voice tight with anger in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Ross is calling relatives. Aunt Carol called me this morning asking if you're okay. I was in the shop office reviewing property appraisal documents Shelby had sent over. What did she say? No, she said Ross told her you're having memory problems. Forgetting dates, sometimes confused. She wanted to know if you need supervision. Milton's breath came heavy through the phone. He's calling everyone dad, uncles, cousins, telling them you're experiencing cognitive decline and need care decisions made for you. I set down the appraisal report and leaned back in my chair. Do you know what your father did last week? I said calmly. I met with an estate attorney, signed brokerage contracts, reviewed legal documents for selling the shop, discussed tax implications and title transfers. My memory is fine. And I know that, Milton said. But Ross is building something. I can feel it. He's building a legal case for conservatorship, I said, laying groundwork to have me declared incompetent so he can take control of my assets. Silence on Milton's end. Rita, he said carefully. Can he do that? He can try. I picked up the pen on my desk and added another entry to my notebook. But under Georgia law, to petition for guardianship of an elderly person, you need clear medical evidence. Court-appointed psychiatric evaluation. Documented pattern of incompetence verified by professionals. And Ross doesn't have that. Ross has gossip, I said. I have a paper trail. Last month I renewed my driver's license, passed the vision test and written exam on first try. 2 weeks ago, I signed complex legal documents with Vernon Whitfield. Yesterday, I reviewed a 50-page property appraisal and corrected 3 calculation errors the appraiser had missed. Which one do you think a judge believes? Milton exhaled slowly. You've been preparing for this. Your brother isn't worried about my health, I said. He's trying to remove the one obstacle standing between him and what he thinks he deserves. He won't win. What do you need me to do? Keep your phone on, I told him. Document anyone Ross contacts with these stories. Names, dates, what he said. If this goes to court, I want a record of his campaign. Done, Milton said. Dad, I'm sorry this is happening. Don't be sorry, I said. Your brother is teaching me something valuable. When you build something that matters, you learn who deserves to inherit it by watching who tries to steal it. After we hung up, I sat in the office looking at the documents spread across my desk. Property appraisal, brokerage agreement, Vernon's preliminary title report, bank statements showing 40 years of responsible financial management. Medical records from my annual checkup 3 weeks ago showing healthy cognitive function. Under Georgia law, to take over guardianship requires clear medical evidence and a court ruling. Ross doesn't have the first and will never have the second, but he doesn't know that yet. He thinks he's 2 steps ahead, spreading rumors, positioning himself as the concerned son, counting down just a few more months until inheritance. He's actually 6 months behind, because while he was calling me the old man at 2 in the morning, I was signing contracts with a broker who'd already found a serious buyer. That serious buyer would come later. First, I needed to set the terms. Shelby Riddle arrived on a Monday morning in early June with a tablet computer and a measuring tape, walking through my shop, like a careful appraiser of something precious, which is exactly what she was. Though Ross had no idea the appraisal wasn't for a loan, it was for a farewell. Shelby was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and professional, with 20 years of commercial real estate experience that showed in the way she noticed details most people missed. She didn't just measure square footage, she noted the condition of the concrete floor, the ventilation system, the electrical panel capacity, the natural light from the north-facing windows. Ross was conveniently absent. I'd made sure of that by mentioning I had a contractor coming to inspect the HVAC system, something Ross found boring enough to avoid. Shelby worked methodically through each section: main workshop, equipment storage, lumber yard, office. She photographed every major piece of machinery, made notes about the property boundaries, asked questions about zoning classifications and utility access I'd never thought about in 40 years of ownership. When she finished, we sat in the small coffee room where Floyd and I used to take breaks. "You have a very well-maintained shop, Mr. Stewart," she said, reviewing her notes on the tablet. "Commercial land values in this area have been rising steadily. With a 40-year established brand and existing professional equipment, I estimate the property value between $1.3 and $1.6 million. I nodded. The number matched what Vernon had projected. "If you find a suitable buyer," I said, "what's the time frame to complete the transaction?" 6 to 9 months if everything proceeds smoothly," Shelby said. "Faster if the buyer has cash and doesn't need complex financing." I looked out the window at the shop floor where I'd spent more mornings than I could count. "I need it completed before February 2024, I said. Shelby looked up from her tablet, her expression shifting to something more serious. She understood what I wasn't saying, that this wasn't a casual retirement sale, it was a race. "Then we need to start right now," she said. We shook hands. She left with a signed listing agreement, exclusive representation for 9 months, and instructions to keep the entire process confidential until closing. Selling something you spent 40 years building doesn't feel like victory. It feels like controlled surrender. But there's a difference between surrendering to the right hands and having something stolen by the wrong ones. Shelby understood that without me saying it. Ross never would. 4 weeks later, in mid-July, Ross arrived at the shop with a stranger. "Dad," Ross said, walking through the door with a man in his 40s carrying rolled blueprints under his arm. "This is Mr. Garrett. He's an architect helping me plan the development project. I wanted you to see the vision." Mr. Garrett was professional, polite, dressed in business casual with the efficient manner of someone who'd designed dozens of commercial properties and saw this as just another job. He had no idea what he was about to show me. They spread the blueprints across my workbench, the same bench where I'd built furniture for 40 years, now covered with architectural drawings of its own destruction. The project name was printed in bold letters across the top: Stewart Commercial Development Phase 1. Detailed drawings showed complete demolition of Stewart Woodworks. In its place, a modern commercial complex with retail spaces on the ground floor facing the street, rental warehouse units behind parking lot, where my lumber yard currently stood. Complete renovation, Mr. Garrett explained, pointing to different sections with his pen. Ground floor retail to maximize street visibility. Warehouse units behind for steady rental income. Estimated project value $4.2 million over 5 years. Ross stood beside him, arms crossed, looking at those blueprints like a man who already owned what he was planning to demolish. I traced the layout with my finger, moving slowly across the page, reading labels. Retail Unit A. Retail Unit B. Storage facility. Parking structure. My finger stopped at one specific spot. The location where Ruth's photo currently hung on the shop wall. The photo of her standing in front of Stewart Woodworks on opening day in 1984, holding our first business license, smiling at the camera like she believed we could build something that would last. On the blueprint, that exact spot was labeled pedestrian walkway connection between buildings A and B, a corridor, foot traffic, strangers walking between rental spaces, never knowing whose memory they were stepping through. Money can rebuild walls. Money can replace machinery. Money can buy land. But money can't resurrect the exact spot where your wife's photo hung for 40 years, witnessing every chair you built, every apprentice you taught, every morning you said good morning to her memory. Ross was erasing what couldn't be appraised. "What do you think?" Ross asked. I looked up at him. At the man who'd called me the old man at 2 in the morning, who'd tried to mortgage my property without permission, who was now showing me blueprints that would turn his mother's memorial into a walkway between commercial rental units. "I need more time to think about this," I said calmly. "Of course," Ross said. "It's a big decision. But Dad, the potential here, this could set our family up for generations." Our family. He said our family like he still knew what that word meant. I rolled up the blueprint slowly and placed it on my desk. "Thank you for showing me," I said. After they left, I stood in the shop alone, looking at Ruth's photo on the wall. She was still smiling, still holding that business license, still believing in what we'd built together. Ross had walked past that photo 1,000 times. Never asked her name. Never asked why she was smiling. He saw a picture on a wall. I saw the reason the wall existed. That photo would matter more than Ross could imagine. But first I needed to find someone who understood what it meant. The day after Ross showed me the blueprints that would turn Ruth's memory into a pedestrian walkway, Floyd sat down across from me in the shop's small coffee room and asked a question that would change everything. "Have you thought about calling Bryce Hampton?" I was drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring at the wall where I'd taped Ross's development blueprint, just to force myself to look at it. "Bryce," I said slowly. "I heard he has his own carpentry shop in Tennessee now," Floyd said. "Doing very well. Still does the traditional work furniture, custom cabinetry, the kind of craftsmanship you taught him." I thought, if you're serious about selling— He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I looked at Floyd, the man who'd worked beside me for 20 years, who'd spotted the Facebook name change before I did, who'd told me about Ross's legal question from 2021, the man who understood what I was trying to protect. Do you have his number?" I asked. Floyd pulled out his phone. That night at 8 o'clock, I sat at my kitchen table with Bryce's number written on a piece of paper in front of me. I'd rehearsed what I would say. Then I'd thrown out the rehearsal and decided to just tell the truth. I dialed. The phone rang twice. "Mr. Stewart," his voice was exactly the same. 15 years since I'd last spoken to him, and Bryce Hampton still answered the phone with the same respectful tone he'd used when he was 30 years old, asking to learn the trade. "Bryce," I said. "It's been a long time." "Yes, sir, it has." "I need to talk to you about something important," I said. "I'm selling Stewart Woodworks, the shop and the land. All of it." Silence on the line. Not the uncomfortable kind, the listening kind. "I want it to go to the right hands," I continued. "I want someone who understands what it took to build it. I want the name kept alive, not demolished for a commercial development." Another pause. Then, "Is your son trying to take it I shouldn't have been surprised that Bryce understood immediately. He'd always been the kind of apprentice who saw what wasn't being said. "Yes, son," I said. "And you're selling it before he can." "Yes. To someone who'll honor what you built." That's the idea. The longest silence yet. I heard him breathing on the other end, heard background noise that sounded like a workshop, the familiar hum of machinery, the smell of sawdust I could almost sense through the phone. "Do you need me to come down to Georgia?" Bryce asked. I felt something lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized was sitting there. "Yeah," I said. "When counting no, as soon as you can. I'll be there next week," Bryce said. "And Mr. Stewart, thank you for calling me." There's a difference between inheritance and legacy. Inheritance is what gets divided up by lawyers and judges after you're gone. Legacy is what gets carried forward by someone who understands what you were trying to build in the first place. Ross wanted the first. Bryce understood the second. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking out the window at the shop in the darkness. For the first time since January, I felt like I wasn't just defending what I owned, I was actively choosing what would happen to it. Before I tell you what Ross filed next in Hall County Court, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think a competency petition can work, or B, if Harry's timeline already beat it, and add one reason why. Please note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. The lesson is what matters. 2 weeks later in early August, Vernon called. "Ross just filed a petition," he said without preamble. "Hall County Court. He's requesting a formal legal competency review." I was in the shop office reviewing property documents Shelby had sent over. I set them down carefully. "Conservatorship," I said. "Yes. First official step." He has sworn affidavits from 3 relatives and 1 neighbor stating you're forgetful, no longer of sound mind, require supervision for your own safety. Which relatives? Vernon read the names. 2 aunts and 1 cousin, the same people Milton had told me Ross was calling with cognitive decline stories. "What happens now?" I asked. "The court will appoint an independent psychiatrist to evaluate you," Vernon said. "Standard procedure. Takes 3 to 6 months to schedule and complete. During that entire time, you retain full legal rights to your property and business decisions." 3 to 6 months, I repeated. "Yes. And even if hypothetically the evaluation went against you, which it won't given your documented competence, you'd have the right to appeal. We're looking at a year minimum before Ross could gain any legal authority." I pulled out my notebook and checked the date I'd first met with Shelby Riddle. April 28, 2023, first broker meeting. Today was August 11, 2023. "Vernon," I said, "what do I need to do right now?" "Keep to the plan," he said. "Visit your family doctor this week. Get an updated medical file documenting your cognitive function, your ability to make complex decisions, your understanding of legal and financial matters. When that psychiatrist appointment comes through, you'll have fresh medical evidence showing perfect competence." "I'll call my doctor tomorrow," I said. "Gee, good." And Harry Ross just showed his hand completely. He has no other moves left, except this petition. That tells me he's desperate. After we hung up, I sat in the office looking at my timeline notes. Timing in carpentry is everything cut too early, and the wood isn't ready cut too late, and the moment is lost. Ross just filed his petition in August. I started selling the shop in April. He thought he was racing me. He was actually chasing my dust. Ross had escalated to the highest level possible without resorting to violence, a formal court petition, to declare me mentally incompetent. It was the legal nuclear option, and he didn't know that nuclear option arrived 3 months too late. By the time his psychiatrist appointment came through, there wouldn't be any assets left to conserve. The asset that would be gone was already being transferred. I just needed to finalize the details with the one person who deserved it. Bryce Hampton walked into my shop on a Thursday morning in late August, 10 years after I'd last seen him, and I knew within 5 seconds of seeing his face that he'd become the man I hoped he would, the kind who understands the difference between price and value. He was 45 now, with the same steady hands and new lines around his eyes that came from years of careful work. When he shook my hand, his grip was exactly what it should have been, firm but not proving anything. Floyd was there. We sat in the coffee room talking about Bryce's shop in Chattanooga, about the furniture market, about techniques and tools. Then Bryce's expression changed. "Mr. Stewart," he said, "there's something I need to tell you. Last November, Ross called me, asked me to sign an affidavit saying you weren't capable of managing your business anymore. Offered me $10,000. I set down my coffee cup carefully. "What did you tell him?" I said no and hung up. Bryce looked at me steadily. "I should have told you then. I'm sorry I kept it from you." Floyd let out a slow breath beside me. I looked at Bryce across that table, the young man I'd lent $800 to 15 years ago who'd paid it back with a handwritten note. The man Ross had tried to bribe with $10,000 to destroy me. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "You already told me the most important thing when you hung up on Ross." Bryce nodded. "I wanted you to know what he's capable of." "I know," I said. "But now I also know what you're capable of. And that matters more." After Floyd left Bryce and I walked through the shop. He moved slowly, not like Shelby the broker evaluating assets, but like someone returning to a place that had shaped who they became. He stopped at each major machine and placed his hands on them, testing their weight and balance. He stopped longest before Ruth's photo on the wall. "I remember Mrs. Stewart," Bryce said quietly. "She brought you coffee every afternoon at 3 o'clock. Always called me by my name." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We returned to the coffee room. Bryce pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and placed it on the table. Not a formal contract, a handwritten offer on lined paper. I unfolded it and read, $1,450,000 cash, Bryce said. All assets, all equipment, all rights to the Stewart Woodworks name and brand. I keep the name. I continue the work the way you taught me, and I start a free apprenticeship program for young people who can't afford training program name Harry Stewart Vocational Fund. The difference between $1,450,000 and priceless can't be measured in money. It's measured in whether the person buying knows whose earrings built the foundation, whose photo watched every piece of wood get shaped, whose name deserves to stay on the sign. Bryce knew all three. Ross never asked about any of them. I read the offer once, folded it carefully, looked Bryce in the eyes. "Don't mind," I said. We shook hands. Then Bryce stepped forward and embraced me. "Thank you for giving me a chance 15 years ago," he said. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," I said. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in mid-September, Ross and Paula arrived at my house with groceries and warm smiles. Paula cooked pork ribs with barbecue sauce, roasted vegetables, fresh cornbread. The house filled with the smell of butter and brown sugar and smoke. Ross set the table, asked about my week, commented on how well the garden was growing. After dinner, Ross leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believes everything is proceeding according to plan. He said in his gentlest tone. "I met with my lawyer this week about the process. He says it'll take a couple months, but there's no problem. Everything is moving along. I just wanted to keep you informed." I ate a piece of rib, chewed, thoughtfully wiped my mouth. "I understand," I said. "Thank you for letting me know." Paula looked at Ross with warm satisfaction. She reached over and squeezed his hand. They believed they were making progress, carefully, methodically building their case. Neither of them knew that on Monday morning the previous week, I'd sat in Vernon Whitfield's office and signed full power of attorney, authorizing the sale of Stewart Woodworks to Bryce Hampton. Every legal document prepared, every detail confirmed. Sitting at that dinner table watching Ross deliver his update felt like watching a man give detailed weather predictions for a city that no longer exists. Accurate, thorough, completely irrelevant. I nodded and ate my dinner and thought about how much effort people waste talking when they should be listening. Paula took photos throughout the evening. I didn't need to see the auto-save notification this time to know where they were going. I already knew the folder name. I already knew what she was building. The only difference between September and February was that her case had grown thicker and mine was almost finished. After they left, I stood on the porch, watching their taillights disappear. Then I walked back inside and looked out toward the shop. Paula recorded that entire dinner into her documentation folder. I saw her phone auto-save the photos with that familiar album name. She's building her legal case, documenting every moment of care, preserving evidence for the conservatorship proceeding. I thought about that while cleaning up the dishes, and I smiled for the first time in months. I smiled because while Paula was documenting her case, I was finalizing mine, and mine would be finished first. October brought the real work, not the kind done with saws and wood, but with lawyers and notarized signatures. Vernon handled the title search, environmental inspections, tax clearances, business valuation audits. Every week, I sat in his office reviewing documents that transformed 40 years of sweat into legal terminology I barely recognized. The title search came back clean, Vernon said one afternoon in late October, sliding a thick folder across his mahogany desk. No liens except the original mortgage you paid off in 2009. Ross can't touch this even if he wanted to. I nodded, signing where he indicated. Shelby called twice a week with updates. Purchase agreement revisions, escrow term clarifications, transition schedule confirmations. Bryce wanted everything done correctly, which meant slowly, which meant carefully. In November, Ross's court date was officially set, February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. The creditors would seize the shop if Ross didn't pay his debts by then. But the shop would already belong to someone else. Bryce wants to close January 15th. Shelby told me in early December, reviewing the final purchase agreement at my kitchen table. That gives you a month's buffer before the court date. Smart timing, Harry. I signed another document. How long have we been working on this? Since April, she said. 8 months. Right on schedule. Vernon called me the same week with different news. Ross still hasn't responded to the court notices. They've sent 4 certified letters. He's ignoring all of them. What happens if he doesn't show up? I asked. It's your default judgment, Vernon said. The creditors win automatically. They seize the assets he listed as collateral, which don't exist anymore, I said. Which won't exist in 6 weeks, Vernon corrected. Until January 15th, you still technically own everything. I've signed 1,000 contracts in my 40 years, as a carpenter, lumber orders, client agreements, equipment leases, but never one that felt like signing away my own name. Every notarized page Vernon slid across his desk was another cord cut. The shop wasn't just a business. It was the place where I taught myself to read wood grain when I was 22, where I built the cradle for Ross when Ruth was pregnant, where I spent 10,000 Saturday mornings watching sawdust catch the light. Now it was becoming a line item in an escrow account. And the strangest part, I felt relief. Because at least Bryce would keep the tools sharp. January came fast. On a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks before closing, Bryce drove down from Chattanooga for the final walkthrough. We were standing in the shop discussing equipment inventory, which machines stayed, which personal tools I'd take, how the transition would work when I saw Ross's truck pull into the lot through the front window. My chest tightened. "Bryce," I said quietly. "Step back into the storage area. Don't say anything." He looked at me, saw my expression, and moved immediately into the shadows behind the lumber racks. Ross walked through the door looking irritated, tie loose around his neck, jacket over his shoulder. "Dad," he called out. "You here?" I met him at the front counter, positioning myself to block the view into the back of the shop. "What do you need, Ross?" "I need you to co-sign a refinancing deal," he said without preamble. "It's a sure thing. I can flip the investment in 6 months. Just need your signature to secure the initial capital." His eyes swept past me, scanning the shop floor. They landed briefly on Bryce's silhouette in the shadows near the storage area. "You got a customer back there?" Ross asked. My heart was pounding. "Just inventory." Ross shrugged, already losing interest. "So what about the refinancing? It's a guaranteed return. 20% in 6 months. "I'm not co-signing anything, Ross," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I told you that last year." His jaw tightened. "You never want to help me build anything. You just want to sit in this shop and—" "The answer is no," I said. He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Fine. I'll figure it out myself." Like always, he turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him. I watched through the window as his truck backed out of the lot and disappeared down the street. The sound of Ross's truck engine fading down the street was the sweetest sound I'd heard in months. My hands were still trembling when I set them on the counter. Bryce stepped forward from the shadow of the lumber racks, his face pale. The afternoon light slanted through the front windows, illuminating the dust motes we'd stirred up when Ross pushed through the door. The smell of pine resin and machine oil hung in the air, the same smell that had clung to my clothes for 4 decades. Everything was exactly as it had always been. Except now, for the first time, I understood that Ross had never really seen this place. Not the work, not the care, not even the people in it. "He looked right at me," Bryce said quietly. "If he'd remembered my name—" "He forgot you the day after he took your money," I said. "That says everything." Bryce nodded slowly. 2 more weeks, and this place is mine. I still can't believe he has no idea." "He's not looking," I said. "He never has been." Ross looked right at Bryce but didn't recognize him. He had forgotten the name of the young man his father once lent $800 to. That says more than anything else in this story. 2 weeks later, on the night before I would sign away everything I'd built, I learned what it means to say goodbye to a place that raised you as much as you built it. I turned off the overhead lights at 9 p.m. and left only the small desk lamp burning. The shop had never looked this quiet. I walked slowly through each section. The main workshop, where I'd spent 10,000 mornings cutting wood. The equipment storage, where every tool hung in the exact spot it had occupied for decades. The lumberyard outside, still smelling of pine and cedar even in the February cold. I ran my hand along the table saw. The metal was cool under my palm, worn smooth in the places I'd gripped it most often. 40 years. Every machine in here carried a scar that matched one on my hands. The shop looked smaller in the darkness. Or maybe I was finally seeing it as it really is, just wood and metal and concrete, while the real work was always in the hands that shaped them. I stopped before Ruth's photo on the wall. She looked the same as she had the first morning I'd hung it there 40 years ago, when the walls were new and we didn't know yet if any of it would hold. We found out. It held. "You always said the shop was my second home," I said to her. "Guess I'm moving out of both now." I took the frame down, carefully wiped the glass clean with my shirt sleeve, and wrapped it in a cloth bag I'd brought from the house. This would come with me. Everything else would stay. I sat in my wooden chair, the one I'd built in 1987, the one that fit my back perfectly after 37 years of use, and looked at the empty space where Ruth's photo had hung. 11 o'clock came and went. I didn't move. Midnight. Still sitting. I built this shop in 1984 with money I borrowed from my father-in-law. Paid him back in 3 years. Paid the mortgage in 25. And now I was handing it to someone who still technically owed me $800. The arithmetic didn't add up. Except it did. At 12:30 I stood up. Turned off the desk lamp. The shop fell into complete darkness. I walked to the door, stepped outside, locked it, and stood there holding the key. Tomorrow morning this belongs to someone else, I said into the cold February night. Tonight it's still mine. I pocketed the key and went home. The next morning at 9 o'clock, I sat in Vernon's office in a small meeting room with a conference table and 4 chairs. Vernon was there. Bryce was there. And a notary public, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a professional demeanor who'd witnessed 1,000 transactions and treated each one with the same careful attention. The papers were already spread across the table: deed transfer, bill of sale, property disclosures, equipment inventory, tax documents, 40 years reduced to a stack of legal forms 2 inches thick. The notary walked me through each signature. "Do you understand that this transfer of ownership is permanent?" she asked. "I understand," I said. "Are you signing these documents voluntarily without coercion or undue influence?" "Completely voluntary," I said. I signed. Vernon witnessed. Bryce signed. The notary stamped each page with practiced efficiency. When the last page was signed, Vernon leaned back in his chair. "One more thing," he said. "Your son's competency petition. Hall County Court dismissed it last week. Insufficient medical evidence. The psychiatric evaluation never happened. The court reviewed your medical records, your recent legal activity, and determined there was no basis for the claim. If Ross wants to refile, the entire process starts from scratch." I nodded slowly. "When was it dismissed?" "January 28th, Vernon said. 2 weeks ago." Bryce stood up and extended his hand. I shook it. Then he stepped forward and embraced me. "I'll take care of it the way you did," he said quietly. "I promise you that." "I know," I said. "How do you measure 40 years?" "In board feet of lumber, in calluses earned, in the weight of a key you're about to hand to someone else." I pulled the shop key from my pocket and placed it on the table in front of Bryce. "It's yours," I said. He picked it up, closed his hand around it, nodded. Vernon gathered the documents into a folder. "The deed will be recorded with the county by end of business today. As of this moment, Bryce Hampton is the legal owner of Stewart Woodworks and the 2.3 acres it sits on." I stood up, shook Vernon's hand, thanked the notary, walked out to my truck in the parking lot. Ruth's photo sat on the passenger seat in its cloth bag. I placed my hand on it for a moment before starting the engine. The sale closed in February 2024. Ross's petition was dismissed in January 2024. I'd won both battles before Ross even knew he was fighting. The shop I built for 40 years now belonged to the apprentice I'd lent $800 to 15 years ago. The young man Ross had tried to bribe with $10,000 and failed. The man who remembered Ruth bringing coffee at 3 o'clock every afternoon. I drove home with Ruth's photo on the passenger seat, the February sun coming through the windshield, and nothing left to protect except the memory of what we'd built together. And that was enough. It was enough for 1 week. Then Ross found out. The phone rang at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I knew it was Ross before I picked up. No one else called with that kind of rage in the ringtone. "Dad!" His voice was shaking. "Someone is repainting the sign outside the shop." "Who are they?" I was sitting in my new kitchen, smaller house, closer to town windows, that faced a garden instead of a workshop. Ruth's photo hung on the wall where I could see it from the table. "On the new owner," I said calmly. "I sold the shop." Silence on the line. "Not the thinking kind, the drowning kind." "You sold it?" "Yes." without telling me, "It's my property," I said. "I don't need permission to sell what's mine. You know I took out loans based on—" His voice cracked. "I put down deposits for the development project. I told investors, the bank rejected your loan application in April," I interrupted, "because I wouldn't confirm you had any claim to the property. You knew that 7 months ago. I put down deposits." He repeated, his voice rising. "Real money, on a project built around that shop." "A project built on property that doesn't belong to you," I said. "Never did." How could you do this?" Ross's voice was raw, now desperate. "That shop was supposed to— Supposed to what?" I asked. "Be yours? You never asked if I planned to give it to you. You just assumed. And when I didn't move fast enough, you tried to take it. I no longer owed him anything. Not explanations, not apologies, not even my time on this phone call." "Who did you sell it to?" Ross demanded. "Someone who deserves it," I said. Then I hung up. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the garden. February flowers were starting to bloom, early crocuses pushing through the cold ground, purple and white against brown earth. I spent 40 years answering to Ross's emergencies, his schemes, his demands. And now, with one hung-up phone call, I was done. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was relief. Ross called back 3 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. Paula called twice. I didn't answer her either. By evening, my phone was quiet again. The next day, Floyd called. Hey," he said, his voice carrying an unusual tone, not quite excited, not quite careful. "I just drove past the shop. The new sign is up." I waited, not saying anything. "It's still Stewart Woodworks," Floyd continued. "But underneath there's a small new line. Says Est, 1984 by Harry Stewart, continued by Bryce Hampton." I sat very still in my kitchen chair. "You there?" Floyd asked. "I'm here," I said quietly. "Want me to take a picture and send it to you?" "No need," I said. "I believe you." "Thought you'd want to know," Floyd said. "Bryce is doing right by you." "I know he is," I said. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, looking at Ruth's photo on the wall. She was still smiling in that picture from 1984, still holding our first business license, still believing in what we'd built together. "My name is still there," I said to her. "Not because I asked, but because he wanted it." She kept smiling. "What's the difference between property and legacy?" "Property is something you can lose in a court case. Legacy is something no one can take away, no matter how much money they have." Ross had tried to steal the property. He'd measured it, appraised it, calculated its value down to the dollar. He'd forged my authority, bribed my apprentice, spread rumors about my competence, filed legal petitions to declare me incompetent. But he never understood legacy. Legacy isn't written in deeds or bank accounts. It's written in the hands of the people who learned from you, in the names they choose to keep, in the respect they show to what came before them. Bryce kept my name on that sign. Not because I owned the shop anymore, not because I had any legal claim, but because he understood what Ruth's earrings had built, what 40 years of careful work meant, what it costs to teach someone a trade when you get nothing back, except the hope they'll do it right. Ross never understood any of that. He saw the shop as an asset worth $1.4 million. Bryce saw it as a place where someone had believed in him when he had nothing. That's the difference. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The February afternoon sun was warm on my face. The garden outside was small, but mine. The house was smaller than the one I'd lived in for 40 years, but it was paid for and quiet and exactly what I needed. Ruth's photo hung on the wall behind me. The shop key that used to hang by my door was gone, handed over to Bryce in Vernon's office. The business I'd built from borrowed money and my wife's earrings belonged to someone else now. But my name was still on the sign. Not because I demanded it, not because I negotiated it into the contract, but because Bryce wanted it there, and that meant more than ownership ever could. My name is still on that shop, not because I asked, but because Bryce wanted it. That is the difference between legacy and property. Legacy is something no one can take away, no matter how much money they have. That difference became very clear over the next 5 days. The phone rang 43 times over 5 days, and I answered exactly 5 of them. Ross called. Paula called. Unknown numbers called that I suspected were Ross using different phones. Each time I picked up, I listened for exactly as long as it took to understand what they wanted. Then I responded calmly and hung up. The first call came the same afternoon Floyd told me about the sign. "You can't do that, Dad." Ross's voice was tight, controlled, trying to sound reasonable. "You know I need that shop." You know you need money," I said. "That's not a reason for me to hand you things that don't belong to you." I hung up. The second call was Paula. "You destroyed this family," she said, her voice sharp with accusation. "Daughter-in-law." I said calmly, "A family is destroyed when you forget your father is still alive." I hung up. The third call was Ross again, angrier now. "I have investors waiting. I have contracts signed. Do you understand what you've done to me? I sold my property," I said. "What you built on top of that without permission isn't my responsibility." I hung up. The fourth call was another unknown number. Paula's voice. "We need to talk about this like adults." "I'm available to talk," I said, "but not to negotiate. The shop is sold. The transaction is complete." I hung up. I no longer felt anger during these calls. Just the same patience I'd shown untalented apprentices who never learned to read the wood people who kept trying the wrong approach over and over, expecting different results. The fifth call came on day 5. Ross's voice was different this time. Quieter. Defeated. "I need to talk to you in person," he said. "You know where I live," I said. I hung up. Talking to Ross those 5 days was like sanding against the grain. You can do it, but the wood fights you every stroke and the finish never comes out right. No matter how many times I explained the same simple truth, he kept pushing back against it, wearing himself down instead of accepting what had already happened. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning in early March, Ross appeared at my door. He looked older, not the 45-year-old man who'd walked through my shop in January, asking about machinery values, but someone who'd aged years in weeks. No suit today. Just jeans and a wrinkled button-down shirt. Dark circles under his eyes, hands shoved in his pockets like he didn't know what else to do with them. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where 6 months ago he'd placed that glossy brochure for Magnolia Senior Living and suggested I'd be happier somewhere with on-site medical care. The same table where he'd delivered updates about his legal proceedings while I'd already signed the power of attorney authorizing the sale. Ross didn't say anything at first. He just sat there staring at his hands on the wooden surface, tracing the grain with one finger. I waited. "I was wrong," he said finally. I said nothing. "But I thought that shop would eventually be mine." He continued, his voice quiet. "And I started acting like it already was." "I know," I said. "I didn't think you'd do that." He looked up at me. "I didn't think you'd actually sell it." "Because you never really looked at me," I said. "You looked at my assets." He flinched, looked back down at the table. "I took out loans," he said. "Real loans. Put down deposits. Told people the development was happening. And now," he didn't finish the sentence, "and now you're facing the consequences of building a plan on property that wasn't yours," I said. Ross's hands were trembling slightly on the table. I watched him try to steady them, watched him try to find words that wouldn't come. "I lost everything," he said finally. The investors pulled out. The bank is calling in the loans. Paula is... He stopped again. We sat at the same table where he'd handed me that nursing home brochure 6 months ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He looked at the wood grain. I looked at him. I don't know what to do. Ross said, his voice breaking. I don't know how to fix this. You can't, I said simply. Some things once broken don't go back together the way they were. He nodded slowly like he'd known that, but needed to hear it anyway. We sat in silence for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall. Outside, birds were singing early spring coming to Georgia, new growth pushing through old ground. Ross looked up at me finally, his eyes red. Do you still consider me your son? He asked. I looked at him for a long time before answering. It was a question I'd prepared the answer for months in advance, from the moment he'd placed that nursing home brochure on this same table, from the moment I'd seen Paula's documentation folder on her phone, from the moment Vernon had told me about the competency petition. I'd known this question was coming. I just didn't know when. I told him yes. I still considered him my son. And then I stood up and walked to the back room to get the ledger. Ruth had kept accounting ledgers for every year we owned the shop, handwritten records in neat columns, tracking every dollar that moved through our business from 1984 until the year she died. I'd kept them in a storage box after she passed, unable to throw them away, but unable to look at them either. I pulled out the ledger marked 1998 and brought it back to the kitchen. Ross was still sitting at the table, staring at his hands. He looked up when I sat down across from him. This is the ledger your mother kept all those years building the shop, I said, placing the worn notebook between us. Flip to March 1998. Ross picked it up slowly. The pages were yellowed, filled with Ruth's precise handwriting, dates, amounts, descriptions. He turned the pages carefully until he reached March. There in my handwriting was a single line that broke Ruth's neat columns. Paid for Ross's debt, $47,000. Ross stared at it for a long time. I didn't know, he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I know, I said. Why didn't you tell me? Because back then, I didn't want you to feel indebted, I said. I just wanted you to have a fresh start. Ross's shoulders started trembling. He set the ledger down carefully like it might break and put his head in his hands. I didn't stand up. Didn't reach across the table to comfort him. I just sat there and let him cry. I was 25, Ross said through his hands. That first business, the wholesale deal that went bad. The bank called you. They did, I said. I thought they worked it out somehow, that the debt just went away. It didn't go away, I said. Your mother and I took out a second mortgage on the shop to pay it. Ross looked up at me, his face wet. $47,000. Yes. And you never told me. Your mother wrote every number in that book, I said. She'd want you to see it. 27 years. I'd carried that secret for 27 years, and Ruth never told him either. She wrote it in her ledger in pencil, one line, no commentary. That's how we handled it. We paid. We moved on. Ross closed the ledger carefully and pushed it back across the table to me. I don't know what to say, he said. You don't have to say anything, I said. We sat in silence for a while. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a car drove past. Normal sounds of a normal morning, while my son processed the fact that his parents had saved him from financial ruin nearly 3 decades ago without ever asking for recognition. After a long time, I stood up and walked to the drawer where I kept important papers. I pulled out an envelope I'd prepared 2 weeks ago and placed it on the table in front of Ross. What's this? He asked. I set up a fund from the shop sale, I said. Free Carpentry Training Fund, named after me, Harry Stewart Vocational Fund. Bryce will run it. Young people who can't afford training get taught the trade for free. Ross looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up. Your name is in it, I said. He looked up at me. What? I want you to join the board of directors, I said. Not because you deserve it right now, but because I want to give you a chance to become someone who does. Dad, conditions, I said. Every year you must spend at least 40 hours working directly with the older craftsmen in the program. Not writing checks, not attending meetings, actually working, learning what they know, hearing their stories, understanding what it means to build something with your hands. Ross stared at me. If you miss a year, you're removed from the board, I continued. No exceptions, no second chances on that part. Why? Ross asked, his voice breaking again. Why do you still want to give me a chance? I looked at my son across the kitchen table. The same table where he'd handed me a nursing home brochure. The same table where I'd eaten dinners Paula cooked while she documented everything for her legal case. The same table where 40 years ago Ruth and I had made the decision to pay his debt and never tell him. How do you forgive someone who hasn't earned it? Yet you give them conditions. You give them time. You give them a door to walk through, and you step back and let them choose. See, because I am still your father, I said. That doesn't change no matter what you do. Ross picked up the envelope with shaking hands. The first board meeting is in June, I said. Bryce will send you the details if you decide to accept. If you don't, the fund continues without you. Either way, the work gets done. Ross stood up slowly. He held the envelope against his chest, like it was something fragile. Can I think about it? He asked. You can, I said. Take as long as you need. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle, turned back to look at me. Thank you, he said quietly. For the 47,000. For this. For still considering me your son. I nodded. He left. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after his truck pulled away, looking at Ruth's ledger still sitting where Ross had placed it. My son picked up the envelope and walked out. I don't know if he'll read it or not. I don't know if he'll accept the conditions or not. But I've done my part. I left a door open. Whether to walk through it is his choice. Ross made his choice 3 days later. He called to tell me he would attend the June board meeting. I thanked him, calmly said goodbye, and hung up the phone. Whether he would actually follow through was something only time would reveal. But I had done my part. I had extended the hand. Whatever happened next was his to decide. Milton's truck rolled into my driveway about a week after that. And honestly, I wasn't the least bit surprised. Milton had always possessed that rare and quiet gift, the ability to know exactly when someone needed company without ever being asked. He never waited for a formal invitation. He simply showed up, and somehow that was always enough. He climbed out of the truck, wearing jeans and a plain work shirt, looking very much like a man who had driven straight down from his office in Atlanta without stopping to change clothes. He was 42 years old, steady and dependable in ways that Ross had never managed to be, even in his best moments. He walked up toward the porch where I was sitting, and he didn't ask me a single question about the shop. He didn't bring up Ross. He said nothing about money, nothing about the legal proceedings, nothing about any of it. He just crossed the porch, pulled out the chair beside mine, and sat down like it was the most natural thing in the world. We stayed quiet for a moment, both of us looking out at the yard. You look healthier, Dad, he said eventually. I feel healthier, I told him. What changed? I thought about that for just a second before answering. I stopped waiting for other people to decide what belongs to me, I said. Milton nodded slowly as if that made perfect sense to him, which I suspect it did. We sat there together watching the yard in comfortable silence, the small garden along the fence, the early spring flowers pushing their way up through the dark soil, the birds singing in the trees above us. like they had somewhere important to be. Two men from the same family sitting together on a porch, with no agenda between them and no betrayal behind them. Just presence. Just peace. "Do you want me to help with anything?" Milton asked after a while. "No," I said. "Just sit here for a while." And so we did. For an hour, maybe longer. Not talking, not needing to talk, not filling the silence with anything that didn't belong in it. Just being there together in the March air with the sounds of the yard all around us. That afternoon reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that sometimes the greatest thing a son can offer his father isn't advice or help or solutions. Sometimes it's simply showing up and staying. That's what sons are supposed to do. Just be there. 2 weeks passed quietly, and then Bryce called to ask if I'd like to come by the shop. I drove over on a Thursday morning in the last week of March. When I pulled up and stepped out of this car, I stood for a moment in the parking lot looking at the sign mounted above the front entrance. It read, "Stewart Woodworks Est. 1984 by Harry Stewart. Continued by Bryce Hampton." I stood there longer than I probably needed to, reading those words, letting them settle in my chest. Then I walked inside. The shop looked exactly as it always had. Same machines positioned in the same places they had occupied for decades. Same familiar smell of wood and machine oil hanging in the air, like something permanent and irreplaceable. Same quality of light coming through the north-facing windows in long, clean strips across the floor. Everything was exactly where it belonged, and yet something had changed, something good. In the far corner of the shop, 3 young men were gathered around a workbench, learning the trade from the ground up. Bryce met me at the door with a quiet smile. "First class of the Harry Stewart Vocational Fund," he said. 3 students, all from right around here, all serious about learning the craft properly." I walked over to them, slowly taking my time, wanting to see them clearly. One of the young men was working with a hand plane on a piece of oak, his movements careful and deliberate, and considered the movements of someone who genuinely cared about doing the thing correctly. He couldn't have been older than 20. He had the focused, slightly furrowed expression of a person trying to get something exactly right, the kind of focus you simply cannot teach, because it has to come from within. He looked up when I approached him. "Now keep your angle steady," I told him. "The wood will tell you if you're doing it right. It always does." He nodded seriously. "Yes, sir." I stepped back and looked at all 3 of them, these young men with their whole working lives ahead of them, standing in a shop built 4 decades ago, with nothing but skill, stubbornness, and the belief that honest work deserved an honest home. And I understood something in that moment that I hadn't quite been able to articulate before, not even to myself. This was what I had been protecting all along. Not the machines, not the real estate, not the property lines or the bank accounts or the legal documents. I had been protecting this, the knowledge, the craft, the living tradition of teaching someone with empty pockets and willing hands how to build something real and lasting from raw material. That was the inheritance worth fighting for. Ruth's photograph wasn't on the wall of the shop anymore. I had moved it to my kitchen 2 months earlier, where I could see it from the breakfast table every morning. But something of her still lived inside that shop. I felt it in the quality of the morning light through those north-facing windows, in the gentle, focused sound of a young man's plane moving steadily across oak, in the smell of fresh sawdust mixing with spring air. She was still there in all the ways that mattered. That evening, sitting alone in my kitchen, I let myself think honestly about everything that had happened, all of it, without flinching. Was Ross evil? No. I don't believe that. He was a man who made wrong choices when fear and greed got louder than his better instincts. Was Paula more dangerous for being smarter about it? Perhaps. Did I bear some share of responsibility for how things unfolded? Probably, My quietness over the years, my habit of restraint when it came to expressing love openly, may have taught Ross, without meaning to, that the way to read me was through assets rather than through affection. That thought cost me something to sit with. But I sat with it anyway. I didn't arrive at clean, definitive answers to those questions that night. But I arrived at something more valuable than answers. I arrived at understanding. Forgiveness, I realized, is not the same thing as forgetting. Forgiveness is choosing to continue living without allowing the wound to determine which direction you walk. The door I had left open for Ross would remain open. My peace did not depend on whether he walked through it. It depended entirely on me. The next morning, I made coffee in my small kitchen while the sun came up outside. Ruth's photo hung where I could see it clearly from the table, looking exactly right the way things look when they finally found the place where they belong. My phone buzzed. A text from Bryce. Saw Mr. Stewart, one of the apprentices, asked me this morning what the shop is called. I told him Stewart Woodworks. He asked who Stewart was. I told him the man who built this place 40 years ago because he wanted to make sure people like you had somewhere to learn. I set the phone down and looked at Ruth's photo for a long, quiet moment. Did you hear that? I said softly. Our name is still there. She kept smiling the way she always had. I picked up my coffee, felt the warmth of the cup in both hands, and took the first slow sip of the morning. Outside the window, March sunlight came through clean and bright, falling across the garden where new things were already beginning to grow. I built it. I protected it. And now it lives beyond me. That's all anyone can ask for. To everyone listening to my story, I want you to carry this truth with you long after you've finished reading. Betrayal rarely announces itself with fanfare. It doesn't kick down your door or scream its intentions from across the room. More often than not, it arrives quietly, wearing a familiar face, offering a warm smile, and extending what looks like a generous dinner invitation. That is exactly how it found me. Looking back now with the clarity that only time and pain can provide, I understand where I went wrong. My mistake wasn't trusting my son. Trust is not a flaw. It is one of the most human things we can offer another person, especially our own children. No, my real mistake was something far more subtle. I ignored the signs. I watched trust slowly transform into calculation, and I said nothing. The first time Ross walked through my shop with that particular look in his eyes, the cold, measuring gaze of an appraiser, rather than the curious eyes of a son, I should have stopped everything and asked him directly what was going on. The first time he suddenly showed interest in helping manage a business he had never once cared about before, I should have asked harder questions instead of feeling flattered by the attention. I waited too long. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. And by the time I finally acted, someone had already started changing my name on the door. But let me be clear about something. This is not simply another one of those revenge stories you stumble across online, designed to entertain you with drama and score settling. This is about something deeper and more meaningful than that. This is about family justice, the real, honest kind that emerges when you finally choose to protect your legacy rather than sitting passively and hoping that betrayal will somehow correct itself if you just wait long enough. I learned through this experience that true family justice has nothing to do with being vindictive or bitter. It is not about punishment. It is about having the courage and the moral clarity to act decisively when the people closest to you have stopped seeing you as a human being and started seeing you as nothing more than an inheritance waiting to be claimed. I genuinely believe that God allowed me to walk through this particular trial for a reason, not just for my own growth, but so that I could stand before others and say this plainly: protecting yourself is not selfishness. It is a necessity. The stories we share in this community, stories about fathers, mothers, builders, and creators who stood their ground, are not rooted in bitterness. They are rooted in dignity. They are about reclaiming what was taken, restoring what was damaged, and refusing to disappear quietly when someone tries to erase everything you worked a lifetime to build. If this story resonated with you in any way, I would genuinely love to know what you would have done in my position. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters more than you know. If you have someone in your life who is currently facing something similar, please pass this along to them. Sometimes the right words at the right moment can change everything. And if you are new here, welcome to Wise Revenge. This is the place where we share stories about protecting what matters most and where family justice is taken seriously. Thank you sincerely for staying until the very end. One final important note. Certain elements of this story have been fictionalized for the sake of clarity and narrative impact. But the message at its heart remains completely and entirely true. Never allow anyone to take what you have rightfully earned.